Oh, right. I can see the hearing room now.
Good morning, Commissioner Shepherd. Are you able to hear us?
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Your image is quite dark. Is there perhaps a light that could be turned on?
Good thought.
Great.
Is that sufficient?
Yeah, that's great.
The point is, I've got sunstrike at the window, so I've got the blind down.
I think everybody's here, and our first order of business is with Mr. Moore for council this morning.
Yes.
Great.
Good morning, Commissioners. I have a series of answers to hand up following some questions that arose during the first week of the hearing relating to the assessment of nitrogen loss reductions in the Waimakariri sub-region for different land use and nitrogen limits. The document, I understand, has been emailed through and is available on the website, but I just wanted to formally note on the record that that information has been produced such that submitters appearing in our next week of hearing are aware that those answers have been provided.
Mr. Moore, thank you for that. I didn't catch it. Just explain to me again, what is the document that's being presented, please?
Yes, thank you, sir. It is a document produced by Section 42A officers relating to the assessment of nitrogen loss reductions in the Waimakariri sub-region for different land use and nitrogen limits. The answers are dated 28 October 2020, and they respond to questions that were asked of officers during the first week of the hearings on Plan Change 7.
Thank you for that. So that's available now to the public on the website?
Yes, it is.
Thank you, Mr. Moore. Now, I think we can go to the business of the day, which is this. We start with the submission of the Opihi flow and water flow and allocation working party. And Ms. Hornsey, I think you're representing them, are you?
Yes, that's correct, sir. Good morning.
Thank you very much. Now, if you'd like to proceed, Ms. Hornsey.
Thank you, sir. Good morning, Commissioners. Yesterday I indicated that I would speak to the planning challenge that the panel are presented with in terms of the National Policy Statement 2020, and with your leave I'll address that now, if I may.
Yes, please. Yes, we're looking forward to your assistance on that, please.
Thank you. Our submission is that, in line with that of the Canterbury Regional Council, that to the extent it can, when making recommendations to the Canterbury Regional Council regarding this plan change, the panel should strive to give effect to the National Policy Statement. And in our submission, the way in which to do that, obviously provided it is within scope, is to identify the various options that submitters put before the panel, assess them against the national policy statement, and then any options that are reasonably practicable that do give effect to the national policy statement should then be tested against the other statutory requirements for regional plan provisions, including those prescribed by sections 32 and 67. We also agree with the submission of the Canterbury Regional Council that the national policy statement does not need to be given immediate effect. And in support of that, we note that the statement itself recognises that achieving their visions for freshwater management units may take time, and that timeframes to achieve the goals set under these visions should be both ambitious and reasonable. And for example, at 3.3c, they say 30 years after the commencement date. So our submission is that when making recommendations on this plan change, any changes to flow and allocation parameters do not have to happen immediately, but they can be staged and planned over the longer term. In terms of the assessment against the objective and policies of the national policy statement, it is acknowledged and accepted that the haora of freshwater is the first priority. However, we also submit that the policy statement also recognises that there are other uses to which freshwater can be put. That is, no one priority is mutually exclusive. When talking about the concept of Te Mana o Te Wai in part 1 of the statement, it says that Te Mana o Te Wai is about restoring and preserving the balance between the water, the wider environment and the community. And again, in our submission, that means that while freshwater and its holder is the first priority, there is recognition that it is interconnected with the wider environment and the community needs. It's submitted that once the panel has assessed the reasonable practicable options against the national policy statement and has found that they can or may give effect to that statement, that those options then need to be evaluated to determine which is the most appropriate, and that evaluation is done in the context of section 32(1)(b) of the Resource Management Act and to achieve the objectives of the plan change. And when considering what option is the most appropriate, we submit that there is no presumption that plan change 7B is notified as the most appropriate or correct. That is, it is open to the panel to determine which is the most appropriate option. That most appropriate means suitable. It does not mean superior. And that where the purpose of the Resource Management Act and the objectives can be met by a less restrictive regime, then that regime should be adopted. In our submission, we say that this reflects the requirement in section 32, 1b, Roman numeral 2, to examine the efficiency of the provision by identifying, assessing, and if practicable, quantifying all of the benefits and costs associated with implementation. So in summary, we are submitting that there is a three-stage approach to be taken, and that provided the panel can be satisfied that the options can be seen as meeting the objective of the national policy statement, that they are then able, if there are several competing options that pass that threshold, to assess them against section 32.
Thank you. Is there anything further you were going to say? Might have a question or two of you about what you've already presented, but I don't want to interrupt if you haven't completed.
No, that's my summary. Thank you, sir.
Yes, well, thank you for the summary, and thank you for providing it more fully in text as you have. I just wanted to come back to a remark that you made that, and I think we're referring now to the 3 priorities, and I think you said that no one of them is mutually exclusive. Is that right?
Yes.
That may well be true as a matter of interpretation, but I'm not sure how that works as a matter of application to a particular set of facts. If in a hypothetical set of facts, I'm not saying that this is anywhere in OTOP, but if in a hypothetical set of facts, the health of the water body required all of the water available, then the health of the water body takes all and excludes any of the matters that might be covered by priority 2, let alone priority 3. Now, is that a correct interpretation?
Well, I accept that that is an interpretation. However, our submission is that yes, the health and well-being of the water is the first priority, but that when one reads through the rest of the statement, it is certainly contemplated that there will be other uses of the water, and that provided a decision maker can be satisfied that the health of the water can be met or will be met over a period of time and improved, where the community decides that is the aim, that those other uses can also follow. But taking your point that if the water needs, or the health of the water needs all of the allocation, then taking that to the extreme, I would have to agree with you, sir, yes.
Okay, then if I come back to the sub-submission that you've just presented, you say that the health of the water is the first priority, but it's contemplated that there will be other uses of the water.
Yes.
I think what you're really saying is it's contemplated that there may be other uses of the water. In other words, there may be some cases where there won't be any left for other uses.
Yes, in some cases that will be.
You agree?
Yes.
Yes. Because at this stage we're talking about the high-level interpretation of the instrument rather than how it applies in a particular water body. Well, thank you for that. There was one other thing that I was going to ask you about, and you might think it's convenient for me to touch on that now, and I'm not sure which of your several clients is affected by this, but I take it that you're comfortable for us to be looking at the cases generally that you're acting in. I'm coming to the question of the subdelegation. And there was a suggestion, and we certainly value suggestions. There was a suggestion that that might be addressed, that's to say the subdelegation problem, might be addressed by the third of suggested options, by which the regional council would have a certifier role. Do you remember that?
Yes, I do, sir, yes.
It's not immediately apparent to me that that avoids the difficulty, if that's the right word, of the subdelegation principle. It seemed to me that because of the subdelegation principle, the council must end up with the power of decision, not merely a more confined power such as certify. And I thought I ought to share that initial view with you so that you can tell me if I'm right or wrong.
I may have to give that some further consideration, sir, but I do understand that Mr. Ensor had proposed that the regional council retain decision-making authority by being involved in making the final decision, and that certifier status, it may not be the appropriate term, but that it be clear that the regional council retains that final decision making power to step in or step out of the regime.
Well, as a lawyer and therefore a wordsmith, would you agree that certifier isn't the right word to use for that? It's decider.
Yes. Decision maker. Yes.
Well, thank you. We're in agreement on that then. Thank you very much for that. We're grateful to you, Ms. Hornsey. I would just like to see if either of my colleagues has some questions on the matters you've been raising before we get on to the evidence. Commissioner Van Portussen, any questions of Ms. Hornsey?
No, no questions, thank you.
Commissioner Sullivan?
No questions, thank you.
Well, Ms. Hornsey, I think we've reached the stage where we can invite you to present evidence. We have from you, just to check that I've listed everything, we have the submission and the further submission of the working party. We have evidence in chief from Mr. Anderson, evidence in chief and an update from Mr. Bell, evidence in chief from Mr. Davies, evidence in chief from Mr. Ensor, evidence in chief from Mr. Hawkins, evidence in chief and an update from Ms. Johnson, evidence in chief from Mr. McAllister, evidence in chief from Mr. Porter, evidence in chief from Mr. Dr. Ryder, evidence in chief from Ms. Saunders, evidence in chief from Mr. Sutherland, evidence in chief and an update from Mr. Webb. Have I left anyone out?
No, you haven't, sir.
All right. Well, I wouldn't be wanting to leave anyone out. So if you would like to proceed to present these, we have of course read all of those statements that I've listed, so that they don't need to read them out to us. But we're not in any way wanting to suggest that we haven't got time to listen to what it is that you're wanting them to be telling us about. We leave it in council's hands.
That is appreciated. Thank you, sir. And I would just point out that Mr. Hawkins is presenting tomorrow afternoon, and
Yes,
that
Yes.
Dr. Saunders is presenting on the afternoon of Wednesday, the 2nd of December. So you won't be hearing from either of them this morning. And I understand.
All right. So they're coming then rather than now.
Yes. And
All right.
Mr. McAllister and Mr. Sutherland, I understand, are not required. They gave brief evidence about the
Oh, yes.
drone footage.
Yes, that's right. Well, we've excused their attendance that seemed to be technical and didn't seem to require them to attend, if you were happy with that.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
And so we'll get underway with the evidence of Mr. Webb.
Mr. Webb, thank you.
Tēnā koutou, Commissioners. With permission, please, I'd like to give a brief summary of my evidence. I've
Thank you, Mr.
prepared a written copy of this, and that has been given to our legal counsel to forward to the hearing officers, along with the brief I presented yesterday for the Adaptive Management Working Group. I'm a Fish and Game Officer for Central South Island Fish and Game and have long associations with the North and South Opua, Upper Opihi and Te Anawai tributaries to the Opihi River. This includes Fish and Game opposing consent applications on all of these tributaries at individual consent hearings through the 1990s. The results of those hearings are the minimum flow regimes that currently apply. The Flow and Allocation Working Party was formed in 2017 by interested parties in response to an apparent absence of an OTOP zone committee process dedicated to local input and negotiation around flow and allocation to contribute to the zone implementation program addendum. While the zone committee undertook numerous public meetings in Fairlie and Pleasant Point, there was no opportunity for informed but informal round-the-table discussion. The FORP consists of community representatives from the 4 tributaries, Timaru District Council and Fish and Game. Despite FORP forming by its own volition independent of the zone committee, the minimum flow regimes, allocation limits, partial restrictions and high flow take provisions in the first steps in PC7 for each of the tributaries largely reflect the recommendations FORP made to the zone committee. Where FORP has concerns is with the second steps. For the South Opua and Upper Opihi rivers, FORP does not support second step summer minimum flows in Table 14.0 and 14Q respectively, and instead supports review of the first step environmental flows at the expected OTOP plan review in 10 years, or about 2030. For the Te Anawai River, FORP does not support introduction of pro rata restrictions in 2030 and instead supports their introduction in 2035. Thank you. I am happy to take questions from the hearing panel.
Well, thank you for that introduction, Mr. Webb. We have, of course, read the update to your evidence statement as well as the principal statement. Any questions of Mr. Webb, Commissioner Van Voorthuizen?
Yes, just a couple of matters. Just the first one, nothing from the supplementary evidence, but a couple of questions from the primary evidence. At paragraph 5.12. And I think I know the answer to this, but the Cascade irrigation race allocation 634.4 and then 97 for community supply. So I just wanted to confirm with you the 97 is not included in the 634, so it's additional to the 634.
That's correct.
Correct, yeah. And that was the only other question. The other matters I wanted to ask you about, you've addressed either just now or in your supplementary evidence. So thank you.
Thank you.
Commissioner Solomon?
No questions from me.
No questions from me, Mr. Webb. I think we've discussed them before.
Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for your assistance, for coming in, for all the effort you put in preparing your clear statements. We value it. Thank you.
Thank you.
The next witness is Mr. Anderson.
Good morning, Commissioners.
Good morning, Mr. Anderson. Thank you.
My name is Greg Anderson, and I farm at the head of Lake Opihi and abstract water for irrigation from the North Opihi. I am the rep on the Flow and Allocation Working Party for the irrigators of the North Opihi, and I am speaking to my submission as a member of the Flow and Allocation Working Party. In my personal submission, I touched on 3 points: minimum flows, adaptive management of the main stem by OFRAG, and the high nitrogen concentrate area in Fairlie. I will not be speaking to the second 2 points, mainly due to the fact that I believe there are more qualified people than I to talk to the adaptive management by OFRAG, though I support how they have managed the river since their inception. And as far as the high nitrogen concentration area in Fairlie, I believe with the changes ahead due to the NPS on essential freshwater, there are going to be changes even to a plan as far advanced as Plan Change 7. I believe farmers in general support trying to lower nitrogen levels in our waterways, but how fast and how far we go is another argument. I intend to talk today to the points in my submission that relate to minimum flows, given as part of my evidence as a member of the Flow and Allocation Working Party. I'm sure the Commissioners have read my submissions and evidence, and I intend to talk to 2 points. First, what myself and the irrigators on the North Opihi are seeking to be changed in Plan Change 7, and secondly, what the members of the Flow and Allocation Working Party hope to see achieved through this process. As a member of the Flow and Allocation Working Party, I believe there is no more qualified group of people in New Zealand in their understanding of the minimum flows in the above dam tributaries. You may believe that I'm drawing a long bow with that statement, but the members of this group, most especially the irrigators, are in the best position to understand our rivers. We live by these rivers. Our families and livelihoods are affected by them. We use them for recreational activities, and yes, we are culturally attached to them. We have also spent considerable time over the last 3 years sitting in meetings on our own time, listening to experts on the environment, hydrology, economics and cultural aspects relating to the minimum flow of these rivers from both sides of the argument. Importantly, we have funded out of our own pockets so we can have a factual understanding of the issues. As I stated in my evidence, and supported by expert evidence, ECAN staff and the Zone Committee, the North Opihi is in pretty good shape. Not perfect, which is hard due to the pressures of past mistakes and the pressures of at times trying to remain economically viable. But the North Opihi is recognised as being not over-allocated, that its biodiversity is damn good, and myself and my children regularly swim there in the summer. Through our consultation process, we were led to believe that the status quo would prevail, but after a better understanding of the pressures on our fellow members of the group in relation to their rivers, that a pro-rata sharing arrangement of our allocation down to our minimum flows would be needed, so as not to breach minimum flows. As stated in my evidence, it is pretty self-explanatory what we wanted changed, and it beggars belief that consensus couldn't be reached at caucusing between our experts and ECAN. I can only believe that the plan writers didn't understand what we were trying to achieve, and I hope the Commissioners here today understand what we are seeking to be changed, and I hope that if there is any misunderstandings from the Commissioners, the appropriate questions will be asked. Where there seems to be some confusion is where our minimum flows would be pitched. Our original minimum flow was 850 litres per second, decided by substantial investment in time and money in the year 2000 through consent hearings and the Environment Court appeal process. We acknowledged that this meant we were running the river down to 781 litres per second, 69 litres seconds below our minimum flow set in 2000. After learning through the consultation process with the Flow and Allocation Working Party and seeing the excellent job that irrigators were achieving on the South Opihi through their voluntary, and I repeat voluntary, water users group administered by Dan Davies in maintaining their minimum flow above the statutory minimum flow so as to protect their river, we agreed to put forward a plan for a water users group to work under pro rata. We believe we put forward a logical plan. The minimum flow was set at 815 litres per second, even though ECAN agreed that our 7-day mouth was 826 litres per second. Under the NES, rivers under 5 QMX, minimum flows will be set at 90% of mouth, meaning our minimum flow is actually could be 740 litres per second. Nowhere has it been recognised that the North Opihi has released a further 72 litres back into the environment via Lake Opihi in relation to the NES. Hopefully this water can be used to relieve the burden being put on other abstractors. It should also be noted that under the status quo, even when we did breach minimum flows, we were still well above the NES on minimum flows. But as pragmatic people, we recognise that we could work with 815 litres per second, plus our affiliated allocation of the AA and BA consents on top, meaning we would start restricting as part of a water users group at 883 litres per second. At this point, the reasons why the AN consent shouldn't be added into our allocation is self-explanatory in my submission and evidence, and also supported by expert evidence on hydrology by Kerry Johnson, and I don't intend to waste your time going over it again. As stated at the start of my statement, I intended to cover 2 points: what the irrigators on the North Opihi felt needed to be changed in Plan Change 7, and what the members of the Flow and Allocation Group wanted to see in this process. One word sticks in my mind: fairness. At the start of this process, I believe the intent of the changes being driven was about water quality, an admirable aim. Although through the consultation period we heard from various experts that quantity does not always relate to quality. All of a sudden, rivers above the dam that have been managed well for 20 years under rules agreed on through a robust process in 2000 were deemed to be in a state of poor quality. No real solid evidence. Yes, some problems that needed rectifying, but no real proof that increasing the volume of water in the rivers was going to improve its quality. I believe minimum flows are an easy target to tick in the box in a plan, and all of a sudden irrigators were guilty and had to prove their innocence. Instead of the way it usually works in New Zealand, that outside agencies realise that you're innocent until proven guilty. The members of this group have put in huge resources of their own time, travel and money to in effect prove their innocence against organisations that are also in part funded by the same people. I use that word again, fairness. These processes are driven by the community input through consultation, through submission processes and attending hearings like this. If central, regional and district governance wants involvement, we need to get some good results in these processes where factual documented cases are put forward. I would like to finish by reading the Canterbury Water Management Statement. Management Strategy Mission Statement. And it says, I quote, to enable present and future generations...
Just pause a moment, Mr. Anderson. I'll just get it out so I can see where it is you're reading from.
Thank you.
Just a moment. Yeah. Page?
I'm not sure, sorry. I just read it out of your plan. It's just the mission statement. Yeah, I wouldn't worry about it. It's pretty self-explanatory.
It's a pretty good book, but...
It's pretty explanation, see what I'm going to say.
Yes.
So their mission statement was to enable present and future generations to gain the greatest social, economic, recreational and cultural benefits from our water resources within an environmentally sustainable framework. Now, a lot of commentary is saying that this has been superseded, and by law it probably has, by Te Mana o Te Wai, which my understanding relates to Te Hauora o Te Wai, Te Hauora o Taiai and Te Hauora o Te Taitanga, which I believe says the same thing in a far better way. And just to finish on the last comment, after listening to your discussion with Mrs. Hornsby, now I understand that there is a priority on these the way we work down. From the top one's about the water, the next one's about the environment, the next one's about the health of the people. Having spent my whole life working in nature, I believe if things are prioritised, you always have unintended consequences. So we've got to keep, I don't believe you can look at them in an individual way. They must be looked at as a whole, even though the law might disagree with me. Thank you, sir.
Mr. Anderson, that's very helpful to have your statement, and we understand it being from the heart and also being based on 20 or more years of experience. Commissioner Van Voorthuizen, do you have any questions to ask of Mr. Anderson?
Yes, thank you. Good morning, Mr. Anderson. Just a couple of matters. I'm looking at table 14M, which is the North Opihi environmental flow regime. can you tell me, in terms of the North Opua, how many consent holders are part of a water user group and how many are not part of a water user group?
So at the moment, Commissioner, we don't have a water users group.
Okay.
Originally, we just worked on getting cut off when we got the minimum flow. Obviously, we'll be going to pro rata arrangement. We'll be in a water users group. We've all agreed to going into it.
Okay. So how many consent, remind me how many consent holders?
3 on the north. No, there's 3 AA and BA consents and 1 AN consent.
Okay,
So he would have to work in conjunction if we achieve what we're trying to achieve.
sure. And does the AN permit holder, does he accept the fairness of stacking the ANs on top of the AAs and ABs? And,
He understands exactly where we're coming from.
okay. They were the only 2 matters I wanted to ask you
Yep,
about. Thanks.
thank you very much.
Commissioner Solomon, any questions of Mr Anderson?
No, thank you.
And I have none either, Mr Anderson. We thank you for coming in and we thank you for all the trouble you've taken in preparing the material with help of others.
Thanks very much.
We now have Mr. Davies.
Thank you.
Good morning, Commissioners. My name's Dan Davies. I'm here to share my views and observations as a member of the Flow and Working Party, as a farmer and shareholder in the Opua Dam, and a member of the Fairlie community. I've farmed a 320 hectare irrigated farm on Ashwick Flat to the southwest of Lake Opua. This gets its irrigation water from the South Opua River via Cascade irrigation scheme, which supplies irrigation water to 2,285 hectares on Ashwick Flat. This scheme is fully piped and supplies pressurised water to its shareholders without the need for any pumping, so it's 100% efficient and monitorable. My wife Jo and I started farming in the Fairlie Basin in 1997 as 50-50 share milkers. As a young family, this decision had higher risks as the land currently had no irrigation and was barren and lifeless. But after 20 years of farming with irrigation and dairy cows, the soil has built up as alive and an abundance of worm life, and now something very special. In 2001, we brought Stonebrook, when the opportunity presented itself. Stonebrook was one of the 3 original dairy farms to irrigate with the formation of the Opua Dam. Now, one of my daughters, her husband and their 5 children contract milk for us. I was eager to get involved with the process and saw that opportunity with the formation of the Flow and Working Party, or FORP. This group was formed to come up with community solutions to a human problem, that is overpopulation and our never-ending demand for affordable, readily available food. These things are putting an ever-increasing strain on our environment and particularly our rivers. Although the OTOP Zone Committee, a community-based group, had already been formed to achieve this, it was very clear that this group was not independent and not a true reflection of community views, but very much under the influence of ECAN. Although full of good intentions, the majority of its members had a very limited understanding of the task and implications, both environmentally and economically, that their recommendations would have, and were soon overwhelmed. This was made an impossible task by ECAN's lack of promised information and studies with which to help guide their recommendations. And to date, we're still waiting. The FORP is a truly independent community group whose members include representatives from Mackenzie and Timaru District Councils, Fish and Game, the Apua Dam, local farmers from each catchment, OTOP Zone Committee members, and environmental and financial experts. Local Arowhenua were invited but not represented. After 2 years of meetings and gathering of information, this group put its recommendations to address the concerns we all have about protecting our rivers for future generations on the table. These were quickly adopted by the OTOP Zone Committee members and put forward in their final recommendations. We are therefore extremely disappointed and confused by Step 2 of Plan Change 7 put forward by ECAN for the South Apua, being an increase in the Stage 1 recommendations put forward by the community of 520 litres a second to 600 litres a second without any explanation or evidence to support this decision. As you have already heard and will continue to hear, the minimum flows in Stage 2 of ECAN's recommendations for the South Apua will have severe economic effects for farming operations and the local and wider communities without providing benefits to the river. The only studies done to date initiated by the FORP show very negligible change of no consequence. Although only 80 litres a second, it cannot be overstated enough the resulting minimum flow recommendations in Stage 2 over time will affect the viability of irrigated farms by effectively putting us into a continuous cycle of drought, resulting in major impacts for both the farming operations and the wider community. These farms have been set up around the water allocated to them over 20 years ago, and a huge investment has been put into them and simply cannot afford to lose the reliability of their current irrigation. Over my 23 years of farming in Fairlie, I have seen this community flourish, so the importance of informed decision making is paramount. Just to be seen to be doing something will result in negative outcomes for all. The current abstraction from the South Apua over the last 23 years has resulted in excellent river health. ECAN acknowledges this fact, and this highlights the sustainability of our current abstraction and puts into question even more the need for changes. I feel with our current extraction, we have a good balance between environment and human needs. It is important to understand that a desired figure, being ECAN's Stage 2 600 litre minimum summer flow, is not sustainable by the South Apua's natural flow, which most summers will drop to 500 litres and in dry years much lower. So to sum up, this process was designed as community-based solutions for its local rivers, to maintain good quality where present and improve rivers that did not meet expectations, and to achieve a balance between environment and human sustainability. I think for the South Apua this has been achieved by the Stage 1 community-based recommendations, and strongly encourage you to adopt these in your final decisions. Thank you for your time, and I appreciate the opportunity to share my opinion and views on this immensely important process for the community that myself and my family live in.
It's a pleasure for us as well, Mr. Davies, to hear you speak and tell us, and we may have some questions for you. Commissioner Van Voorthuizen?
Yes, good morning. Just want to ask you about Table 14N, the South Apua flow regime. And you mentioned in your pre-circulated evidence that your para 2.7, and you mentioned it again verbally that in your view, you know, the river, the 500 litres per second is the natural summer flow. I noticed in your evidence you mentioned Mr. Steetskamp, that he was as part of FORP with you, and in his submission he requested that the minimum flows for December and January and February be set at 500, not the 550 and the 520. What's your view of that?
I think the 520 is basically with what the community group has decided as a fair compromise to try and meet, you know, everyone's expectations.
Yep.
And also to meet the river's requirements.
Yep. Okay, so you're basically happy with that?
Yes, I mean the farmers were part of the group.
Okay.
and you know that's a group decision that's been made.
And the 550 in December, the same answer?
Yeah, look, yeah. I mean, it's a compromise that
Okay.
you know farmers have tried to make to go forward and achieve good results all round.
All right. Thank you very much. That's all I wanted to ask you about.
Commissioner Solomon, any questions?
Yes, I have one. I refer to your paragraph 2.8, Mr Davies. You mention a lack of understanding of hydrology and trying to meet the cultural flow aspiration of 1,200 litres per second. And I'm sure you'd agree that we would need the context to properly understand what is meant by the aspiration. I recognise that farming for 23 years by the South Opihi River would give you some hydrological knowledge of the area, but you would agree, wouldn't you, that 23 years worth of hydrological knowledge is really only a blink in time in the hydrological history of the area.
Yeah, my meaning of that statement was that a 1,200 litre year-round flow, cultural flow, is simply not achievable by any stretch of the imagination with that river. It drops to 500 litres.
Well, perhaps not in these days, but once upon a time it may have.
There's no abstraction above, well, there's about 100 litres that comes out above us, so and it comes straight off the mountains off snowmelt. So there's no human intervention basically before we take water.
Thank you. I have no further questions.
In the same paragraph 2.8, Mr Davis, you refer to aspiration to meet cultural flows. Do you know of any activities by local iwi in this part of the Opihi River?
None that I'm aware of.
Do you know that if the local iwi have expressed any interest in traditional sites in the South Opihi Valley?
I mean, like I said, the local Arawhenua were invited. We encouraged them to try and come to our meetings to play a part, and they weren't represented.
Thanks, Mr Davis. We do appreciate that you came in and told us all that you have, and we appreciate the trouble you went to in preparing your full statement. Thanks very much indeed.
Oh, thank you.
And the next witness is...
Good morning, Commissioners. My name's
Sorry.
Murray Bell. And
Just a moment, Mr
Sorry.
Bell. I didn't catch who it was until just a moment ago, and I just want to bring your statement on the screen so that we can follow it with you. It's a bit of a slow process. Now I've got your statement there, Mr Bell. Good morning and thank you very much for coming in, and we'd like you to understand that we've read the statement that you've given us, but we would like you to speak to it as you would like.
Thank you very much, Commissioners. As I said, I am Murray Bell. I'm representing FORP in this presentation, which, as you've heard, has been formed 3 years ago, and we're grateful for the help that has come on board from community. We also acknowledge Mr Mark Webb, Dr Greg Ryder, Grant Porter, that have been part of this decision making for what is most probably a compromise on farmers' point of view, but we realise that in the interests of going forward of creating an environment that is safe for our future generations, we are here and participating. So my summary takes that you've read the supplementary evidence supplied as well. So in conclusion, I'm here to remind Commissioners that 25 years ago we began a journey of preparing for irrigation, putting up dollars up front to purchase shares in the dream of having an irrigation storage dam that would enable us to have irrigation water 90 to 95% of the time. We've continued to pay costs for this for the last 21 years, and that has benefited the South Canterbury community ecologically, environmentally, socially and financially. So to my knowledge, the mainstream of the Opihi is not run dry in those ensuing 21 years of Lake of Pure's operation. We have special benefits across our communities which, and with increased employment in the region, benefiting from the availability of reliable water. The farmers that irrigate above the dam feel they have all contributed to the health of the river and their water charges, funding the reliability and environmental flows that flow from the Opihi main stem. Farmers do want good, healthy streams and rivers that are safe to drink, swim in, and we also need reliable water, which I believe that we are demonstrating in some additional graphs supplied by Dr. Greg Ryder in this past season, where water indicators were showing levels of good to very good, with exception being the dissolved nitrogen, which still needed continued monitoring. I'm not a water quality expert, and I defer to Dr. Ryder, who will speak later, but his summarisation for me was the cyanide factor was good. It deteriorated late autumn through lack of river flushes. Peripitus, excuse the pronunciation, was good. Dissolved phosphate was very good. Nitrate was good. Ammonia was very good. DIN needs improvement. So my observations from this, and I realise this is a one-year graph, but our river flowed at levels under our current regime, which would have been restricted under step 2, something like 70 days, 68 days, I think, from the graph, and 36 days completely shut off. So what I'm trying to explain to the commissioners here is that water quality retained good qualities even at the lower flows, and obviously FORP have presented a step 1 to the zone committee for their input, which they adopted as step 1. Where we have difficulty is being step 2. So my observations, the interesting details about the results from the upper and lower Opihi river stem is DIN is a factor that needs continuing farm management improvement to bring to acceptable levels. The DIN is not an irrigation issue though, but is showing a spike in winter, which affects the average. Doesn't appear to occur at high loads during the irrigation season. So it's not just a linear line showing that more water will decrease nutrient levels. And this is my observation. It actually shows that no irrigation water is occurring when we have the increased DIN levels. So this suggests issues relating to farm management needing improvement and winter grazing and stream fencing. I'd also like to point out that looking back on the farm diary, the other thing that cropped up was E. coli levels spiked 2 times, and after checking the farm diary, it was after substantial rainfall events. So basically the E. coli stayed at all acceptable levels, excepting after these 2 river flushes. So to me, the information that's been gathered in this past season shows that these levels are slightly too high in winter, need on-farm management expertise applied. A Pure Water Limited will not supply shareholders unless they've a farm environment plan that is audited to retain the access to irrigation water supply. So with the freshwater reforms being applied, it necessitates that all farmers will need to be proactive in the space of farm environment plans. I believe we will see the continued incremental improvements to our water quality in all of our rivers as the benefits of waterway fencing, winter grazing management, reduced applications of nitrogen, and the piping of domestic water occurs instead of open water races that currently occur. These measures are already in place and starting to happen. So let's focus on outcomes and not on rules for 8 years' time. That will do little for our environment, but be detrimental to the financial viability of our farms. We see from Mr. Grant Porter's financial analysis that sheep and beef farms and dairy support would be defined as marginal, and dairy farming is still sustainable but with big reductions in profitability. Give Table 14P the recommendations the chance to prove to everyone that indeed our river is safe to drink, swim and fish in and irrigate from. 14Q is a step too far. So thank you for the opportunity to present our case, and we would certainly ask that you would look seriously at our request. Thank you.
Well, you can be sure of that, Mr. Bell. Thank you. But we may have some questions that we should ask of you while you're here. So I'll see. Commissioner Van Voorthuizen, any questions of Mr. Bell?
No, no questions, thank you.
Commissioner Solomon?
No, no questions from me.
You must have been very clear, Mr. Bell, as you were to me as well, with no questions for you. Thank you very much for coming in.
Thank you very much for the opportunity, and I wish you all the best with your decision making.
Thank you.
The next witness will be Ms. Johnston.
Thank you. Good morning, Ms. Johnson.
Good morning. How are you today?
Now, you know what happens in our way of doing these things, Ms. Johnson. We've already read your full evidence in chief, and we've already read the update that you've provided us with. And so now you have the opportunity, if you choose, to speak to it, and then perhaps we'll have one or two questions for you.
Thank you. No, look, I don't have too much to add this morning. Obviously, I have the benefit of a fairly large chunk of my evidence being agreed on and addressed with ECAN through the joint witness statement for hydrology, so I will just take questions from you this morning.
Thank you. Commissioner Van Voorthuizen, any questions of Ms. Johnson this morning?
Yes, just a couple of questions. Just a minute. Just from the primary evidence, just a question about community supply takes. It's at your para 4.5. You don't need to turn to it though.
Okay.
You say those abstractions are not subject to any minimum flow, and you say as a first priority use, but obviously that's changed now with the MPSFM. Are there any, is there any kind of obligations imposed on community supply takes in relation to the minimum flow? Do they need to scale back at all? Do they need to do water supply management planning? Do they need to issue water shortage instructions to their residents, or do they just get off scot-free?
When those consents come up for renewal, so the ones that I've been involved in to date, they have had conditions imposed on them that do require them to prepare a water management strategy, which, and one of the details that needs to be covered off in that strategy is how they will obviously manage water delivery in times of low flow. So while they are not subject to the planned minimum flow per se, they do have to put measures in place that means that they are reducing their take as the flows do reduce in the rivers.
And you say those conditions are routinely imposed upon renewal of consents?
Yes, they are, and there is, and that is through land and water plan policy that exists currently. It would be also fair to note that most of the consents through the OTOP zone that are for community supply are yet to go through that process. Off the top of my head, I can think of, I think, 2 that have gone through a renewal process and have had those conditions imposed.
Okay. Paragraph 9.9.
Yes.
Just a minor point, so 4 lines down that sentence in terms of availability, this was the worst season in recent years of irrigation restrictions, I just didn't quite understand that sentence. What were you meaning by that sentence?
So the 2014-15 season was obviously one of the worst seasons in terms of restrictions having been imposed that had occurred for quite some time.
Okay.
And so instead of 2 to 3 times higher than they actually were for that season, it should actually say 2 to 3 times higher than any other season that has occurred in recent times.
Okay. Okay, so that was a really bad year and it was 2 to 3 times worse than other years in
correct.
relation to the amount of time on restriction.
Correct.
Okay. Now, just one question from the supplementary evidence. And it's at your para 3.2, the very last paragraph.
Yes.
Now, just to remind you, and you talk about the, and I've addressed this in several questions, the stacking of the AN permits on top of the AA and BAs, which I understand the rationale for that. Now, there's one of the catchments where there's only one consent holder. I think it's the South Opua, where there's only, is it the Cascade Irrigation Scheme is the only abstractor? So is that an issue in that catchment?
No, it's not. It's only for the North Opua, Upper Opihi and Te Anawai.
Okay. So we don't need to worry about that for the South Opua.
Correct.
All right, no, that's all I wanted to ask you. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Commissioner Solomon?
Yes, I just have one question under paragraph 10, implementing on-farm mitigations.
Yes.
So are you outlining here the additional costs because of the onset of environment plans?
I'm sort of setting the scene in this section of my evidence, not just for necessarily implementing farm environment plans, but implementing good management practice and the other expectations that now exist around farming to manage water quality effects.
Okay. Thank you. That's all.
Thank you.
In 736, you talk about a situation where restrictions do not align, and you describe ECAN's current approach, which you understand will carry through to PC7.
Yes, correct.
Now, some of us are still learning how to apply this business of the obligatory priorities. Do you think that ECAN's approach that you've just described is consistent with those obligatory priorities or not?
Yes, so the context obviously of that paragraph in my evidence is to highlight the fact that where you're subject to 2 management regimes, so in this case a tributary flow regime and the Opihi main stem flow regime, that the restrictions required won't always line up. So in other words, one may be more restrictive than the other at any given point in time. And obviously it's the more restrictive of those regimes that applies on a particular day. And so to me, that does
necessarily fit the priorities, the hierarchy?
Well, it obviously means that it's the least amount of water that is available between the two regimes that wins on any given day. So yes, it does. It means that you're not taking more than what the worst case of the two regimes would allow you to take.
So that would match the priority one?
Yes.
Fair. Right. Thank you for that. I'm still learning about this. That's all. Thank you, Ms. Johnson, and
thank you, Commissioners.
Appreciate your coming in again.
That's all right. You'll see my face several times this week. So
well, splendid. We'll be glad. Just hold on.
Next we'll hear from Dr. Ryder.
Thank you. Good morning, Dr. Ryder.
Good morning.
We've read your statement, of course, and are you going to speak to it, or do we go straight to questions?
I'd like to just make a few candid comments on my evidence and...
yes, please do. That's fine.
Just provide a bit of context in that I first was approached by Opihi Water to do a review of some water quality work done by ECAN back in 2017. And that work showed some concerns around water quality and ecosystem health in these tributaries that the Flow and Allocation Working Party are associated with. Following that, we set up, or Opihi Water set up which I was involved with, a water quality monitoring program that started in January 2019 and has run ever since on a monthly basis. I think there's only 1 month during the COVID lockdown period in March or April where sampling hasn't been undertaken. So we're now in a position where we've got a very good data set on water quality and benthic ecosystem health, which I've reviewed, and Mr. Bell had a look at the Upper Opihi River as well in his submission that you've just heard from. And I think I've come to the conclusion that by and large water quality in these tributaries is good, or at least acceptable, apart from dissolved inorganic nitrogen, and principally nitrate in some of the tributaries, and occasional spikes in E. coli. So there's that aspect of it. And then when I started looking at the flow regimes proposed under the OTOP zipper and then in PC7, and I've come to the conclusion that, well firstly, the fork flows and have pretty much fallen in line with the PC7 step 1 flows, and they all provide pretty good habitat for most of the species that are present in these rivers. And when I say good habitat, that's under minimum flow conditions. And that the increases, the step 2 increases for South Opihi and the Upper Opihi provide some minor gains and some minor losses for some of the species, but really don't make a huge improvement or even what I would regard as a significant change in habitat availability. And nor do I think they'll change the water quality and ecosystem health of those rivers either, because, as I've said in my evidence, I think that's principally driven by land use activities and climate. So you won't get any improvements in stopping temperature elevations occurring. You won't get any improvements in periphyte and nuisance growths. So I just thought I'd put that in there at this stage because I think that really encapsulates the findings, the key findings from my evidence.
Yes, well, thank you for that. Anything further you'd like to say before we go to questions?
No, apart from the joint witness statements, we pretty much agreed on the flows. So I think, and also the values and the water quality status of these rivers.
Thank you. Questions for Dr. Ryder? Commissioner Van Voorthuizen?
No questions, but I did find your evidence very comprehensive and helpful, and it was quite good for me to see how succinctly you could summarise 74 pages of evidence in your executive summary, particularly your paragraph 3.3, which captured everything that followed quite nicely. So thank you very much for that.
Commissioner Solomon?
Yes, I have several questions for Mr. Ryder. At your paragraph 4.37, I think it is. I'll just find it. And I think you're talking, oh no, I've got the wrong, I'm talking about trap and transfer, but I've got the wrong paragraph. Never mind, we won't go to there. We'll go down to 525 instead. In this paragraph and in others, you use the words food producing water. So that I don't make presumptions, can you explain what is meant by that term?
Sure. So that's generally a term that we use. The principal food item for almost all fish species in these sorts of rivers is benthic invertebrates. So they're the insect life and other life like snails and worms that live on the bed of the river, typically underneath the gravel or sometimes coming out on the top to graze on algae. That is the primary food source for fish, and so that's what we refer to as food producing water.
Okay. And at your paragraph 526, I must be missing something because how does increasing minimum flows by 100 litres a second over the summer months provide some gains in habitat for these species, but not for juvenile long-fin, short-fin eels, and both species of bullies due to losses in their habitat? What am I not understanding?
Well, different fish species and different life stages of fish species have different habitat requirements that are affected by flow. So, for example, a juvenile eel, an alva, may prefer very shallow water, very relatively fine gravel it can burrow into, and water that doesn't flow very fast. So it doesn't have a great flow requirement, whereas an adult eel that might weigh 5 or 6 kilograms, it's got quite a deep body on it,
That makes sense.
has a deeper, so it requires deeper water, and sometimes it might have a different preference to velocity or the type of substrate that it might want to hide amongst. So depends on the species and life stage, have different habitat requirements, and of course as the flow in a river increases, the average depth, average water depth, average water velocity changes, which suit some species but not necessarily others, and the same applies to a life stage of a...
Talking about velocity, torrent fish prefer velocity, don't they?
Yes.
That's why they're called torrent fish.
Yes. We find, well, torrent fish they're basically benthic dwellings, so they almost sit on the bed in very fast flowing water typically, often in shoots. They're quite limited in their distribution because they have quite defined habitat preference with respect to velocities.
Yeah. Thank you. And just one more. At your paragraph 10.5, and again I'll just get it near the bottom. At the bottom of page 73, as you talk about, as I understand, targeted stream augmentation is often proposed as a mitigation method for increased nitrates in water because of dilution effects. So as you say, nutrient levels may not be flow related, but higher flows will dilute nutrients, won't they?
Not necessarily.
Oh.
But only because in these sorts of catchments, which are, a lot of them are dominated by agriculture land use, so the runoff from the land is, the runoff is primarily from agricultural land, so you've got nutrients in that system. So if you have rainfall and the runoff increases, you typically, nitrogen levels will increase as well. So it's not, if it was clean water coming from up catchment, then yes, you could get some dilution.
Yes, no, I understand.
But what we find in winter times, when there's more water in the rivers, is that the nitrate concentrations are typically higher then than they are in the summertime.
Again, that makes sense. Thank you. Thank you, that's all from me.
Your approach to assessing minimum flows, Dr. Ryder, which you describe or start to describe in 5.8. And you say the outcome of the analysis was modified to accommodate competing interests between in-stream, river biota, and out-of-stream, that is, abstraction needs. Now, however well justified those accommodations between those two different kinds of need were at the time that you made them, my interest is whether those accommodations are questionable in principle now because of the Regional Council's obligation to give effect to this hierarchy of priorities. Now, I know, and you've reminded us in your statement, and I do expect and respect and acknowledge your particular area of expertise. But I thought I should ask you this question and see whether you've got an answer to it.
If I was setting flows purely for the benefit, if I was setting, no, I'll keep that. If I was setting flows for the benefit purely of the river ecosystem, or ecosystem health, I'd be setting much higher flows, because you'd be probably looking at, well, what's the optimum flow for a particular species? And for a number of species, it's much higher than the minimum flows we're dealing with in this case. But the reality is that would be pointless in that a lot of these optimum flows for certain fish species and other life in the river are at flows much higher than what the river would typically get to in the summer anyway, with or without abstraction. So I could come up with a whole different set of recommended flows for ecosystem health, but they probably wouldn't be achieved even under naturalised flows. And the other compounding factor is that, and I think we talked a bit about this yesterday, different species have different preferred habitat conditions and different optimum flow requirements, and that what might be good for a flow that's good or optimum for one species may be terrible for another species. So as far as I'm aware, we don't have any one particular species that we are trying to manage for these rivers. We have a bunch of native fish, we have several salmonid fish, and we also have the angling amenity that goes with the salmonid fishery. So trying to land on a flow that sort of compromises and provides for all of those is a balancing act, and you can't get away from that.
Thank you for your answer. Now, in the next paragraph, you refer to some evidence that you gave in the Lindis case. Was the assessment that you gave in evidence in that case wholly accepted by the Environment Court?
I think it was.
And is it amongst the aspects of the Environment Court's decision that's currently the subject of an appeal in the High Court?
I can't answer that question, sir, accurately. I'm not sure what aspects have been appealed to the High Court.
No, all right. I'm not suggesting you should know the answer, but I think it was right that I should ask the question, because that's a question that comes to my mind when I read it. Dr. Ryder, thank you very much again for your evidence. We're grateful to you as always.
Thank you.
Perhaps, Ms. Hornsey, we're just about time to take the morning break. It might be sensible if we do that now, and we'll come to the next witness after the break.
Yes, thank you.
Okay. We'll adjourn for a quarter of an hour.
Tramper, very bad fisherman, but I have an interest in the environment as well. So a lot of the farmers I deal with from Canterbury to Southland, they all value the, whether they're irrigated or not irrigated, they value the quality of the water, and they have a very keen interest in seeing it protected for not just for their own use, but the public, their livestock. It's a very key requirement to their business. I'll summarise my evidence and then take questions, but my key findings in diving deep into the numbers here were that step one, whilst not an ideal outcome for some of the farmers in these areas that are irrigating, it was a much better outcome than step two, which is nearing on disaster for some farmers, which become completely unviable and uneconomic to continue. The hardest hit areas were the Te Anawai and South Apua regions, where dairy farming was basically the only sustainable business coming out of it. When you get double-digit drops in earnings before interest, and that is the key driver of how I determine viability, that becomes unsustainable year on year when you are trying to, and that's without taking into account a debt loading and the individual circumstances of farmers. But so step one, some farmers can probably live with some of the changes. Step two is that most of the farms that are in the or users of the water in Opua would be unsustainable other than dairy farming. I firmly believe that farmers are very adaptable people. They if given the chance to change and use better techniques for farming to get better results, they will. But when we bring time frames forward and we don't give them the time to adapt, and they can only adapt so far, and you can take away some water, but taking away too much water means that it's not even viable to carry on and try to find water saving techniques, better ways of irrigating, better ways of farming, that not only just help their profitability so their families can live on the farm, but also for the environment as well. So I found it a little bit troubling that in the Section 42A report that there was no sort of real comments around the economic viability of what Plan Change 7 was going to do to some of the users in terms of the farming communities. And on the other side of the coin, Mr. Simon Harris's report went some way to addressing this, but again, there were no real comments as to his report, but I think he didn't go far enough, and I think he could have probably underestimated the impacts on those users, and that's not just across, I know we're talking about Apua shareholders today, but it's across the other regions as well, and sub-catchments. So when we take away water, we see a massive impact to not only the profitability, but also the value of the farming land, or the assets that these families are owning. So what are the other options for these guys if you do take away water? Massive drops in income, massive drops in land value. You really are affecting their livelihood that they've built up over a number of years and number of generations. And if you bring forward the time frame for implementing Plan Change 7, a lot of the mitigants that farmers can probably put in place are going to have to be funded somehow or other with capital. And when we look at the environment for borrowing capital in the marketplace now, if there's any uncertainty out there, and there's any sort of, they like long-term certainty of being able to produce income and have a very solid asset base to be able to borrow that capital to put these measures in place. I don't think that Plan Change 7 and certainly Step 2 is going to help even Step 1 changes if they come into place. I guess when I look back and I took my model farm and I applied it across some of the real scenarios out there, what I found was that most of these farmers are going to need a very, very good run of a lot of rain in the summer. They're going to need to have everything go their way if they're going to remain viable. And that's just even under Step 1. If they're going to then have to put on, so there's going to be a compounding effect of good management practices and nutrient requirements on them. So you can probably add that on top of my numbers and say that this is possibly a best case scenario of what I've modelled. I don't think it gets too much better other than the fact that it might rain every second day during the summer. I can't model that, sorry. Farmers are going to need to invest in storage, on-farm storage, and that might be okay for some, might be viable for some to do that, but again, others may not be able to do that. I just think that for farming, Step 2 is like for these irrigators in this area. I think that Step 2 is possibly like COVID was to the tourism industry. So that's my brief summary. Happy to take questions.
Commissioner Van Voorthuizen, any questions of Mr. Porter?
No questions, thank you.
Commissioner Solomon, any questions of Mr. Porter? Commissioner Solomon, any questions of Mr. Porter?
No questions, thank you. It's my, there it goes. No questions, thank you, David.
Okay, very good. Yes. Thank you, Mr. Porter. There's no questions for you. Good morning, Mr. Ensor.
Good morning, sir.
Now, we've read your evidence and chief statement, thank you. Is there anything you'd like to speak to about it before we go to questions?
And I think this morning we've probably covered a few of the matters I would like to highlight just in questions of other witnesses, so I'm happy just to take questions.
Very well, thank you. Commissioner Van Voorthuizen?
No questions, thank you.
Commissioner Solomon?
No questions, thank you.
Mr. Ensor, I wanted to ask a question about your 7.5, please.
Yes.
Now, adequate direction can be signalled through clear objectives and policies while not foreclosing the opportunity and so on. If I accept that objectives and policies would be adequate signals, would exact numbers be better than adequate?
And I think we probably traversed this matter a little bit yesterday, and I think
yes, we might be able to take it a little further.
Yes, so I think in certain circumstances numbers could be better than adequate, provided that the numbers are set in a way that is robust and is adequately forward-looking, and probably in light of discussions we've been having over the last day or two, adequately consider the priorities and how they're going to be applied as per the NPS. On the flip side of that, if the numbers are not right, for want of a better term, then my view might be that they'd be less than adequate. In fact, they may end up with driving some perverse outcomes. And I know we discussed yesterday investment decisions, and it may be that that it diverts capital that might otherwise be better placed to solutions that aren't required or don't go far enough.
Yes, well, it was just a slightly different way of thinking about it than the discussion we had yesterday, and so I value your answer, Mr. Ensor. Thank you for that. And that's all we have for you this morning.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Lindsay?
Yes, that's the evidence for the working party today, noting that Mr. Hawkins will be speaking tomorrow and Dr. Saunders will be speaking in December, 2nd of December.
Yes, very good. Well, thank you very much, Ms. Hornsey. We appreciate that. Now, the next item on our business is the Temuka catchment, and that's, I think, for 2 o'clock this afternoon. So we'll now adjourn the hearing until 2 o'clock this afternoon.